Have you ever taken a personality test? Something like the Myers-Briggs, or even just one of those goofy online social media quizzes that's supposed to tell you what Game of Thrones house you belong to? Well, most personality tests, I think, run the gamut between completely frivolous, or actually giving you some useful information, but not necessarily something that you're going to use to any practical effect. But wouldn't it be cool if you could define your personality within a specific context and actually be able to use that information proactively to help you achieve a goal? Well, good thing you're a poker player. I'm Steve Wannall, your poker guru. Welcome to the Tavern Poker Podcast. If you sit down at a poker table with a bunch of regular poker players, even just once, you're likely to come away with memories of a lot of different characters. There are the young punks who take the game really seriously and try and intimidate you. There are the old senior citizen gamblers who are there just passing the time. There are the loud, gregarious trash talkers and the quiet, introspective types, the angle shooters and the sports fanatics, and then just some people who are there to have a good time. But this isn't what I'm talking about when I say poker personalities. Your poker personality generally refers to one of 4 different types that are recognized amongst poker strategists and pros. And those types can be defined by the combination of 4 different and specific attributes, namely passive, aggressive, tight, and loose. And how those attributes combine say a lot about how you play the game and where it's likely to lead you strategically. Now, as always, this is fairly basic poker strategy that we're discussing here, and so many of you are probably familiar with these terms, but for those of you who aren't, let me just quickly define some of them. And even if you are familiar with them, this really bears repeating, because while you may have heard it and you always think that you're one type, it really helps you to take a close look at it and to reevaluate every now and then to see where you fall in the way that you are playing. So to define them, let's start with the obvious. Let's go with aggressive. Well, I think most people understand what that means. You hear about being aggressive a lot at the poker table. It's the main strategy that people tell you that you should employ when you're at the poker table. It's the main thing that people tell you you need to be. Well, what does aggressive mean? Well, in poker terms, it simply means you're taking the betting lead. You are using your chips to establish dominance, to send a message to the table, and as a display of strength. Being aggressive and taking the betting lead means you're the first one to put out a bet. It refers to the fact that you're the first one to act as far as that's concerned, meaning you're opening the action, and it also refers to how big you're making the size of a bet. It can also mean taking the lead away from somebody else by raising. That's what being aggressive means. And if you do this more often than not when you play a hand, meaning if you're the one trying to take charge instead of just calling or checking, etc., then you are an aggressive personality type at the poker table. The opposite of that, of course, is passive. Well, what does that mean? Passive simply means you're not taking the lead. It usually means you're letting someone else do the betting, you're letting someone else dictate the action of the hand, you're reacting more than you are being proactive. Examples of being passive, then, would be limping in to see a pot, just calling the big blind and not putting in a raise if you have a good hand. After the flop, it could mean checking instead of betting. It means calling rather than raising. Generally, anything that keeps the action closed or doesn't do anything to control the size of the pot. Anything that doesn't force decisions onto the other players in the hand. And the next 2 attributes are also diametrically opposed to one another. They are tight and loose. And this is usually referring to your hand selection, meaning what kinds of hands you're willing to play, how often you get involved in the pot. If you're tight, for example, then that means you don't play a whole lot of hands. You wait for the good stuff, you wait for good positions. You're very, very selective about when you choose to get involved in a pot. Loose, of course, is the opposite of that. That means you're a little more indiscriminate. You're not really that selective about your hands. You're going to get involved a lot. You're going to play a lot of different hands from a lot of different positions and in a lot of different situations. Okay? Those are the basic definitions of those 4 attributes. Where your personality comes into play, your poker personality, is in how you tend to combine those attributes at the table. Most people will tell you that tight aggressive is the way to be. That's something that a lot of people will hear. You need to be a tight, aggressive player. What does that mean? Well, simply that you play few hands, but when you do play, You play them very aggressively. You take charge when you decide to play. The reason this is a good idea is because it tells people that you don't get involved unless you've got really strong hands, and then you're playing in a way that reinforces that idea, that you have very strong cards, you have a strong position, you're willing to fight to take this down. That can be a hard strategy to combat. But that's just one personality. The others include loose passive, tight passive, and loose aggressive. And they're pretty self-evident, but just to quickly define them, loose aggressive means you play a whole lot of hands and you play them very, very aggressively. It means you're always in there mixing it up, you're always firing in big bets, and your cards don't necessarily matter as much to you. Your position doesn't necessarily matter as much to you. It's really more about the naked aggression that you're showing. You're trying to play a psychological game. You're constantly putting hard decisions on your opponents. You're looking to take down a lot of pots without a fight. And you're looking to get people guessing onto what your hand range is, which is very, very difficult because your hand range is wide open. Next, there is tight passive. Tight passive means you don't play a lot of hands, and when you do play, you're not really taking charge. You're going to really, really selectively choose your spots to just limp in and call. And loose passive is, of course, very similar, but it means you're just playing more often. You're going to limp into a whole lot of hands. You want to see a whole lot of flops, but you want to do it cheaply. You don't want to take charge in the hand. You're just going to let the cards dictate the action. So those are the four personalities. You're obviously not going to see personalities that involve two of those things that are opposed to each other. You're not going to see a tight, loose player or a passive-aggressive player, although some people might argue with me on this point. So anyway, those are the four main poker personalities. Now, there are some other personalities that people could argue are out there. Generally, those have more to do with nicknames for certain behaviors that I think are associated with the other personalities. For example, you might hear someone referred to as a nit. That often refers to someone who is tight and passive, meaning they don't play a whole lot of hands. It could also be tight aggressive if that person is really, really tight. So tight is the operative word when you're talking about a nit. That's someone who doesn't play a whole lot of hands. You might also hear someone being referred to as a loose cannon or even a maniac. Those are players that tend to fall on the more loose aggressive side, or what we would call a lag player. Lag standing for loose aggressive. I tend to refer to certain people as landmines. That's my own word to describe a passive player. You never really know just how strong they are until they call you and you realize that they slow-played pocket aces the whole way. Or they just simply got lucky and flopped a set, and you would never know because they didn't bet the strength of their hand. But let's evaluate some of these personalities, because I think it's important to understand that they are out there and that you can identify specific players as one or more of those personalities, and mostly it's important to try and identify what kind of player you are. Now, the reason to know that information, the reason to figure out if you fall into one of these personalities is not necessarily to change it, but you should be aware of it. It's really important to have that information for the sole reason that that is kind of like your default setting. Now, as always, I am a big advocate of adjusting your play to suit the situation. I think you should constantly reevaluate where you are in a hand. You should constantly mix up your play. You should change your hand ranges. You should play different hands differently in different positions. You should play your strong hands differently according to the dynamics of the table and the specific situation that you find yourself in. Always be adjusting. That's my main poker philosophy. And that means being conscious of your poker personality so that you can change that deliberately when the situation calls for it. But it's really important to know it because when you start having a lapse in concentration, maybe you're in a long tournament, you've been there for hours and hours, all of us tend to get tired or we just lose focus. We tend to go on autopilot. And that means we're not thinking as much about it. We'll tend to just look down at our hand and notice, this isn't something I want to play, and we'll just instantly throw it in the muck. Maybe you'll just zone out for a little bit, and you'll forget to be paying attention to the other people at the table, even when you're not in a hand, so that you can get tells on people or track their betting patterns or whatever. But you tend to just zone out, you go on autopilot, and when that happens, when people start to lose their focus, lose their concentration, which is inevitable, they will usually revert back to their poker personality. They will start playing in the way that is most comfortable to them, the way that is most natural to their personality. And that's something that you got to be aware of because you need to be careful of it. It is something that is exploitable by your opponents, but also it might be something that's not necessarily good for your game. And if that's true, then it's something that you need to work on. Now, I think it's always something that you should be working on. That's an aspect of your game that I think you can always actively work on, that you can always try to experiment with and work to improve. But it starts with simply knowing what your personality is. Now, I think a lot of us like to believe that we are tight, aggressive players because they've heard that's the best way to be. I believe that's true, personally. I don't necessarily think that means every one of us is as tight, aggressive as we like to think we are. And also the idea that it's the best way to be is kind of a matter of opinion. There are a lot of people who believe that loose aggressive is the way that you should be, because you should always be in there mixing it up. You should always try and control the action. You should be ready to take advantage of any situation. And in order to do that, you have to be involved in the pot. And I think that requires a specific mindset. It requires a specific skill set that is a little bit different from my own. But at the same time, I'm someone who tends to jump back and forth between some of these personalities because, again, like I said, I believe the right thing to do is to try and adjust. You need to be aware of each of these personalities because you can jump into those personalities when the situation calls for it. You can pretend to be a specific kind of personality. And sometimes you're just playing a role right from the start. Now, as I said, I like to think of myself as a tight, aggressive player. That means I'm someone who is very selective about the starting hands and the starting positions that I play. But when I do play, when I do get involved in the pot, I try to be the one driving the action. If I am in middle position, for example, and no one has done anything significant yet, maybe everyone's folded to me, maybe they've just limped into the pot so no one's raised, and I look down at a good hand, with a bunch of limpers ahead of you, it's tempting to just call there. Sometimes it's tempting to call even when everybody's folded to you because you don't want to chase away the action behind you. But I've really tried to adhere to the philosophy that if your hand is worth calling with, then it is worth raising with. That is the moment where you become a tight, aggressive player. You're the one who wants to send the message out there first that I'm the one who has the good hand and I'm the one who's going to drive the action. Obviously, you have to be ready to reevaluate in the event that someone raises you from a later position or they try and take the betting lead away from you on the flop or something. You have to reevaluate where you are because there's a good chance you might not have the best hand. But generally speaking, it's better to send that message early. You want to be the aggressive one. But sometimes you don't have control over that kind of table image. I usually go into a big tournament if I know that it's going to take at least 3 or 4 hours in order for me to reach a money bubble, or maybe it's going to be even longer. Maybe it's 5, 6, 7 hours before I realize this tournament's going to be anywhere close to completed. You really want to pace yourself. So I tend to go into a tournament with the strategy of, all right, I'm going to play this really, really tight up front. I'm going to be aggressive when I have good hands, but at the same time, I don't want to get myself overly involved in something. I don't want to have hard decisions right off the bat because this is a marathon and not a sprint. And if you're really getting into those high swing situations early on, well, the blinds are going to be small, the bet sizes are going to be smaller, you're not going to win larger pots. So if you're 3 and 4 betting at, the first level of a tournament, it's not going to have nearly the same impact as doing that at level 6 or 7. But like I said, sometimes you don't have control over that. While I try and create a really tight table image early on so that my raises and my bets are going to be taken more seriously later on, sometimes you don't have a choice. A really good example of this is something that just happened to me just a couple days ago. I happened to win a tournament. Yay me. But one of the things that happened early on in this tournament was I won the first 6 hands I played at my table. Now, this is really unusual for anyone in a tournament to have that kind of a streak, especially right off the bat, to win 6 hands in a row. It's even more unusual for me because I am a tight player. A lot of people wouldn't believe that because I tend to mix it up a bit. But I am a very tight player, especially early on in a tournament. Well, when you win the first 6 hands of a tournament, that really changes the way people are looking at you. And the reason I won those 6 hands was it was situational. I had a lot of pocket pairs. I had a lot of hands that I got to see a cheap flop with, and they hit the flop really hard, and I was able to grab it away from people. I flopped 3 different sets. I picked up pocket 10s and pocket aces. I just had a lot of really good hands, and that dictated that I was going to be really, really active. And when that happens, when you plan on going in with a tight image, but you end up that active early on, well, the image is out of your control. You now have a table image as a loose player, and people are going to start reacting to you that way. And sometimes you just have to play that role. Sometimes you can say, well, I can use this image to my advantage. It might help you pull out a pretty good bluff later on. It might more accurately get you a call on a really strong hand later down because you've been so active they think he can't possibly have a good hand every single time, so they'll call you when, once again, you have a really strong hand. I definitely benefited from that in those 6 hands. After raising 3 in a row, I got calls from a bunch of people only to discover that, I had a really good hand yet again. But the nice thing about that is after that streak ended, I was able to effortlessly revert into a tight player, and it mixed up my image automatically. It helped me adjust to the situation a little bit more. And it's also interesting to note that I was able to then act passively on some of those hands. When you have a strong hand, several hands in a row, people might end up getting gun-shy against you. They're going to realize that, you've just shown down 3 winners in a row, and here you are raising again. Well, they're going to get out of the way. And that actually happened to me on the last hand of this 6-hand streak. I flopped a set, I hit top pair, I flopped another set, I think I hit 2 pair on one point, I had an over pair on a small board that I wound up taking down the pot with. Finally, on hand number 6, I'm under the gun, and I had pocket aces. I could hardly believe it. After 5 hands of just winning, here I had pocket aces under the gun. I put in a raise. Once again, everybody folded. I just ended up stealing the blinds. Now, a win is a win, sure, but there was also a part of me that felt that maybe I should have just limped in there. Maybe I needed to control my table image a little bit more. Maybe I needed to disguise the strength of that hand to try and get some value out of it. And that was simply because of my image, of being really loose at that point. So you can switch between the personalities and get a lot of mileage out of it. That being said, while I think that there is some value to each different kind of poker personality you can have, I think there are some that certainly stand above the rest. The rest meaning all 4 of them. There's 4 that we're talking about here. Tight aggressive, loose aggressive, tight passive, loose passive. Which ones are better? Obviously the ones that have aggressive in the title. Now, there is a little bit of value to some of the other styles, but only if you use them sparingly. If you're really first starting out in the game of poker, like you are really, really rank amateur. We're talking you're at the level of you don't even really understand exactly how the blinds work and a tournament structure. Maybe you even have to have a cheat sheet with you to tell you what hand beats what. Then actually tight passive might not be a bad way to start. If you can be tight aggressive right out of the gate, hey, go for it. Absolutely. But when you're just trying to get your bearings, tight passive isn't necessarily a bad way to go because you should know enough to be selective about the hands that you choose to play, so you need to be learning what the good starting hands and what the good starting positions are. And sometimes it's okay to be a little bit passive, at least early on, so that you can see what other people are doing. You can go to school on them. This is a time when you can build a little library inside your head of people's tells or people's betting patterns or their own personalities. Is the person to your left what you would consider a lag player? Are they constantly trying to bully you out of pots? Are they constantly raising? Are they just limping in every time to see as many flops as possible? If that's the case and you recognize that you just flopped a really strong hand or something, then that passivity might actually get you paid off because it'll be hard to put you on a hand and you can lay a trap for them. But again, this is something that I would not stick with. We're talking a very specific situation here. Why? Because in general, being passive is something that you just don't want to do at the poker table unless a very specific situation calls for it. If that's your default, if your default is to be passive, you're going to tend to get run over at the poker table. It's going to be really easy for seasoned players to play against you. Sometimes you'll crack them, sure, but it's much better to be dictating the action. It's much better to be putting the hard decisions on your opponents. But I think each of these things, each of these personalities, is something that has to be tempered with your knowledge of the game and what you're observing from the situation. While being aggressive is really, really important, you can't just do it in a vacuum. You can't do it without paying attention to what's going on around you. Because then the passive players, even if they don't intend to, might just be laying just enough rope for you to hang yourself with. If you're too aggressive and you don't watch where you're walking, that's when you step on what I call a landmine. But then there's some specific things you need to know about being tight versus being loose as well. While I advocate being tight aggressive like a lot of pro players do, you do have to be careful with the level of tight that you are playing. If you are too tight, then you become easy to read. It's really easy for people to narrow down what your hand range is, meaning the kinds of cards that you like to play and are likely to have in any given situation. If you only play the premium hands, people are going to learn that really fast. Playing loose is the flip side of that coin, obviously. Now, while that's going to be really, really difficult for people to put you on a specific kind of hand if you're playing all the time, it also means that you're likely going to set yourself up to lose a lot of chips or to be suffering from what we call variance. Variance simply referring to the way your chip stack will go up and down over the natural course of being involved in pots. The more you play, the more you're going to be a victim of variance, meaning you might just be riding a roller coaster, and you got to be prepared to navigate that. So how do you figure out what poker personality you have? What is your default setting? What is the personality, the strategy type that you're going to revert to during those times when you're not even thinking about it? Well, if you just Google poker personality test, you're likely to find a whole lot of different sites that are willing to figure that out for you. And there's a lot of different types of tests that you can take. They're going to put you in different poker situations. They're going to ask you certain questions on what your first instinct is, if you're holding certain cards, or if you're sitting in a certain position, or you have certain people at the table. Sometimes it's a lot more esoteric, though. Sometimes you're going to get a list of things like, what celebrity do you most closely associate with? And they'll give you, a really aggressive personality like Howard Stern, or someone who's a little more reserved like, Ron Weasley from Harry Potter or something. But I don't necessarily think you have to take one of these tests to figure it out. You can observe your own play and figure out what you're most comfortable with, what best suits your style. And I think that's the thing to really take away from all of this. It's not necessarily about forcing yourself into a certain personality type, but just paying attention to what feels the most comfortable for you. What is the natural way that you play the game? What are your natural-born instincts as far as how you approach the game of Texas Hold'em? And once you know that, it's a little bit easier to try and figure out exactly a strategy that works for you. And speaking of mixing it up, you might find that you're not just one of these personalities. Some people will discover that they tend to fall into more than one. While I said it's not often that you're going to see a passive-aggressive player or a tight-loose player, there are definitely players who could be considered tight-aggressive/loose-aggressive. They tend to straddle that line. For me, I had to be really honest with myself when first trying to identify the type of personality that I had, in that I tended to blur the line between tight aggressive and tight passive. And, I did get some mileage out of being tight passive because I was the type of player who really loved to lay traps for people, and I still do. I do still get some mileage out of that, but it was also something that I had to work on because I really didn't want to be a passive player. I just have to keep in the back of my mind that that's my default setting. That's what I'm going to revert to if I start going on autopilot. It's my comfort zone. And you don't want to stay in your comfort zone too long. So it's okay to revert to your natural state, even if it isn't the pure tight aggressive that we all believe we want to be, just so long as you can use it to develop a strategy that makes sense for you. And of course, there are a lot of opposing viewpoints on what a good poker strategy is. And I think that just proves that there's a lot of different philosophies, there's a lot of different ways to play this game, and there is no one person who has all the answers. The answers are always going to be different for each person. So ask yourself that question. What is your personality? How do you tend to play this game? What actions can you take? What specific actions can you take to mix it up a little bit? And there's even another crazy thing you can try, which is to simply convince people that you're one type of player when you're another. I think there's certain players who have this down to a science. I think Poker Hall of Famer and world-famous pro Phil Hellmuth benefits from this quite a bit. Now, his poker nickname is the Poker Brat, but that's not really a poker personality. That's his character. That's the character, that's the persona he has, but it's not his poker personality. He tends to have this reputation of being a very showy, flamboyant player. He's a big personality. Some people might consider him a narcissist. He's very, very full of himself in his professional demeanor that he puts forward, and in his behavior at the table can often be kind of erratic, and he's called a brat because he tends to have these big, epic meltdowns when he gets bad beats or when people make plays against him that he questions. You know, when people put a bad beat on him, he'll throw a tantrum at the table. That's where the whole poker brat personality comes from. But if you actually pay close attention to his game, what you'll notice over time, over a large selection of looking at some games that he's played in, is that he's a fairly straight-up, tight, aggressive player. He definitely mixes it up quite a bit, but his hand selection is generally pretty tight, his use of position is very solid, and the way he uses aggression, and the way he flits back and forth between being aggressive and going into trap mode and being passive is very, very solid. He's a pretty straight-up poker player. There's not a lot of crazy in his game, so the personality that he displays at the table is generally pretty different from the way he plays. And there are a lot of other players that can be said of. I know quite a few that I play with personally who have a reputation for being real loose cannons. You know, they're players who have shown down a couple of crazy hands every now and then, but if you're really paying attention to what they're doing, they're playing some pretty straight-up poker. They're being just typically tight aggressive. But because they can create a character that they're playing, or do things like try and get into their opponent's head. They play a psychological game. You know, that's not their personality. These are specific tactics that they're employing. I know one or two people who pretend to go on tilt, or they like to berate their opponents for specific plays that they made because they want to get inside of their head. They want to buy real estate inside their mind to try and put them off their game the next time they get involved in a hand together. I know other people who do the opposite of that. I know some people who are just really, really friendly and gregarious at the table, and, you know, they never shy away from revealing their hand to show people that they had something good, or they'll just turn over a bluff and say, oh, I got you that time, you know, because they're just trying to put people at ease and make people like them, because people are more likely to give you their chips if they like you, or if they're just playing a fun game with you. But again, that's not a poker personality. That's just a tactic you're employing, so that you can mask the personality that you actually have, so that you can sort of disguise the way that you're playing. Wordplay is something that you'll see employed by a lot of different people to try and mask what they're doing. There was a very controversial figure from the World Series of Poker a couple years ago by the name of Will Kassouf, who was famously obnoxious at the table, and he defended it as saying, oh, it's just wordplay, it's speech play, I'm using this as a tactic against my opponents, you know, I'm just trying to give false information or get information from them so that I can try and take down a pot from them. Now, that was how he described it. A lot of people thought it was verbal abuse, and I'm not going to argue one way or the other what it was. What I will say is just look at the way he was actually playing his hands. What you'll see is someone who is very loose aggressive. He was a lag player. He wasn't tight. He was getting involved in a lot of different situations, and he was doing that specifically to disguise his hand range so that you wouldn't be able to put him on a specific hand. And that's very hard to play against. But the way he would mask that is by trying to get inside your head. He would tell you he had certain kinds of hands, and then he would change his story midstream and say, actually, I was doing this. And because he threw so much information at you, he was attempting to keep you off your guard. But really, if you're just paying attention, you would just notice a loose, aggressive player. This is a guy who wanted to play a whole lot of hands, and he wanted to try and take it down by using other tactics, whether he hit or not. So aggression was his main tool. So what is your poker personality? Take a good look at yourself. That, I think, is the real purpose of my wanting to bring up this topic of discussion on this episode. Because your hardest opponent in the game of poker is always going to be yourself. The best way you can improve is by looking inward, not looking outward, not trying to figure out what other people are doing. It's important to do that, but the most important person you should be looking at is always yourself. The biggest thing that you have control over in the game of poker or in how you approach anything is by looking at yourself and saying, what can I change? What can I improve? Do I need to change anything here? Where can I find a spot to mix things up? What different tactics can I employ? Is there a hole in my game? How do I fill that hole? And, of course, what is my poker personality? How do I tend to play the game? And then ask yourself, how can I use that to my advantage? I'm your poker guru, Steve Wannall, and this has been the Tavern Poker Podcast. Do me a favor and share this with your friends. Give me a like, subscribe. You could also suggest some future topics that you'd like me to discuss. What is an aspect of the game that you'd like to hear more about? Is there something I've already touched on that you think needs further clarification or just a deeper discussion? I want to hear from you. Let's keep the poker discussion rolling. And until next time, if you're looking for a great way to improve your game, maybe all it takes is just a little bit of personality. As always, thanks for listening.